full. And at EPC_EU. I should have also mentioned not only written questions. If you want to ask your question in person, please click on the raised hands button and then I will allow you to talk when the time comes. I won't ask you to turn your camera on to minimize technical issues, but I will ask you simply to turn on your mic. So let us get underway. And I talked earlier about that opening keynote that's going to inspire and set some context for our discussion. I am delighted to welcome Professor Nicole Grobert, chair of the group of chief scientific advisors to the European Commission. She's going to talk, as I said, about evidence-based policymaking and advice during COVID-19. And she will take, I'm going to ask her a couple of questions afterwards. If you have any questions, she's also happy to take those. So Nicole, a very warm welcome and over to you.
Thank you so much, Jacki, for a warm welcome. It's quite exciting to be here at this final ProRes conference. Final, but not final, I hope. So I've been asked to comment or maybe give a few words on the evidence-based policymaking and scientific advice during COVID, unprecedented times, and how we can provide responsible and ethical scientific advice during crisis in general. Where to start? It's such a complex problem, but a key word that springs to my mind is trust. Trust is the basis for society to function. All relationships are based on trust. A child unconditionally trusts its mother. And when we feel unwell, we go and seek help from a medical doctor whom we trust. And we need to trust the doctor to help us. Equally, research is based on trust and trusting the data that we have obtained, trusting our colleagues or colleagues who present data that they have obtained. Yet, trust beyond that of a mother and child is mainly built upon experience and the critical and typically evidence-based exchange between two parties. Through evidence such as helping someone without gaining any personal benefit can strengthen trust. Time itself, extended exchange over time can help to strengthen trust. And trust is crucial also when it comes to science advice. And science advisors need to be able to trust the scientific evidence in a given field in order to be able to provide recommendations. Policymakers in turn need to trust the scientists who advise based on scientific evidence, and society needs to trust the policymakers for a country or an entity to function well. I'm sure you can think of many more examples where trust really is critical. However, there's a risk that this trust is undermined by unrealistic expectations. If citizens and policymakers expect science to speak always in one voice and provide absolute certainties, absolute answers. If politicians appeal to let's follow the science to evade their own responsibilities, it has to be a balanced interplay between the two. As scientists, we know that gaining scientific knowledge is complex. Scientific knowledge is tentative, and we have to also acknowledge those limitations. We have to acknowledge the independence of politicians. Scientists have to bear in mind that policymaking is not quite a different world, but it's an environment where perhaps slightly different rules apply. And therefore, we need to recognize that politicians have a certain area in which they can act. And we need to mutually trust each other and build respectful relationships with politicians. Building trust takes time in everyday life and when it comes to science advice. Yet COVID, in many ways, hit society as a whole like a lightning strike, or worse, because typically lightning strikes are not ongoing like a pandemic. And that really I intensified the challenges I just alluded to. So crisis, COVID, we need quick answers and ideally solid answers that mustn't change, but this is difficult to achieve in a short time frame. So the specific challenges that occur in crisis, scientific advice during COVID, In the context of the group of chief scientific advisors, what the group has done, so we've published 2 documents in this period in collaboration with the European Group of Ethics and Professor Peter Prott, Special Advisor to the President. And critically, here one must distinguish between the science advice that is needed to respond during the acute phase or in an emergency phase, and that is needed to address longer term outcomes, i.e. strategic advice longer term. Yet both are really important mechanisms which have different dynamics and require different approaches. And the role of the group of chief scientific advisors specifically is to provide science advice at the EU level and the sort of the longer term outcomes. What is actually quite interesting, COVID has really brought science advice onto the stage. It's widely visible it's become widely visible during the pandemic, and especially when it really was very acute. However, there's a risk of individual high-profile experts being called upon to provide advice on everything, the voice of science. So one person has the load on its shoulders to have all the answers ready for policymakers to decide. What really is critical here for sound advice and ethically sound advice, we need adequate mechanisms with a broad expertise that need to be in place and visible, and policymakers need to have the right incentives to consult them. And what we mustn't forget, society has values, and it's important to take these values into account when it comes to science advice. For this, a suitable framework to help researchers and research organizations to do so in a systematic way could be very helpful to achieving this efficiently. And achieving scientific integrity and ethically sound evidence for science advice is the basis for building trust, which also takes time. Now, the second word I'd like to throw in here is uncertainty. Communicating the uncertainty is absolutely vital. To build trust, you have to be able to communicate uncertainty and make sure that people don't assume that one answer is the final answer and it's the only answer. The scientist, a member of the group of chief scientific advisors to the Commission, and as chair of that group, it's particularly important to build that trust. And communicating these findings and scientific evidence in a clear, accessible manner is one of the most important tools for building trust. We need to say what we know. We need to say what we don't know. We need to say what's uncertain, and also highlight what really is unknowable. Critically here is to communicating risk and uncertainty without undermining trust in science advice. It's difficult, but it can be done. And we must be transparent and open in explaining how we analyze scientific evidence and how we develop policy options and recommendations. Basically the pathway, how we reach recommendations, make that transparent and open. Reasons for diverging scientific views should be clarified and explained whenever possible in the most accessible way. And expert panels are key, and evidence reports should aim at consensus, not at the expense of the rigor of the deliberation, but ultimately consensus should be reached. And dissenting views should be documented and explained. The legitimate scientific dissent can be useful to policy. For example, it may offer early warnings on the importance of the problem or minor scientific views. Where do we go from here? Just to conclude, well, just to repeat, in times of crisis, trust is even more important. It's even more important to be transparent in communicating uncertainty. And if the shorter term, we provide the advice, the higher the uncertainty is. And the longer term, or the more time we have to provide advice, it's less uncertain. So it's important to find that right balance. And it's even more important to collaborate, connect with others, and to communicate well. And this applies to all areas of life, including science advice, and your network is providing that as well. In Europe, we have a great diversity of such mechanisms due to the different political cultures and institutional histories. This is also where values come into play. And we need mutual understanding and better connection, because there is not just one answer, not one size fits all approach. We need to communicate, we need to build that infrastructure, that environment in order to drive forward. We need better connected science advice ecosystem that brings together advisors from across thematic areas and from different countries with different backgrounds. And building such ecosystem takes trust again, it takes time, and therefore continuing efforts in this direction are absolutely vital for a better Europe and the world as a whole. So thank you. Those were my 10 minutes. You're muted.
There you are. I'm always telling other people they're muted and then forgot to unmute myself. Thank you so much for that. It covered a lot of ground there. Just a couple of issues I'd like to pick up with you, if I might, just on this question of certainty versus uncertainty, because you said early on, citizens expect certainty. And then you explained why uncertainty is inherent in the process, particularly, for example, in COVID, when you, as you said, quick answers were wanted. Politicians also want certainty. When you give politicians advice on what they should do, they want certainty. How do you deal with the tensions there? Because they say, okay, well, that's it. That's what we need to do. And that solves it, does it? And you go, well, it's complicated. How do you deal with that? Not just with the public, but also with the policymaker?
Well, ideally, you would want to give an answer that is certain, but like you say, it's often not possible. And I think each party has its role. The scientists have the role in providing the evidence, in providing the background, in providing information, how certain, uncertain, but also politicians take a function in that they take political decisions. And sometimes personally, you think, oh my God, how can they take this decision? But they have so many other factors that they need to consider to take a decision. Then in the end, it's also their job to make that decision.
Absolutely. You also talked about needing to tap into broad expertise. You need advisors from all backgrounds for the holistic approach that we need. And you said we need the right mechanism to consult them. What sort of mechanisms work? How do you make sure you've got everyone round the table you need?
Well, to be able, I mean, key would be to consult as broadly as possible, but it's also a humongous effort to consult as broadly as possible. In our case, we have the SAPEA network, this European network of all European academies teamed up, and that's coordinating over 100 academies and seeking experts from within that network, but also from beyond. And of course, there's always more and there's always better one can do. But for that, we need the infrastructure that we were describing earlier in order to pull together the other efforts within Europe and beyond.
And we don't have that now? That infrastructure doesn't really exist?
There are a lot of initiatives, but from my understanding, there is not necessarily one door to go, one shop to access, and
yeah.
then that coordination.
So we need to look at that. And the other thing I just wanted to pick up on was you talked about the scientific advice that's needed, you said, to respond to an acute phase of a crisis, and what is needed to address the longer term challenges. You said it's different, it has different dynamics and requires different processes. What did you mean? What is the crucial difference between the two?
So, for example, short acute phase advice could be a statement based on the know-how of a smaller group of people. Longer term advice or intermediate term advice, such as what the group provides, is when the process takes over a year or so to identify the experts in the field, complementary experts, doing literature reviews, searching for evidence, building working groups, meeting stakeholders, exchanging with experts, and having them provided an evidence review report, which is scrutinized by referees, other experts in the field. So it's quite a long process, but touching a broad background and complementary expertise.
Thank you. There's a question from Nicola Dotti in the audience saying, thank you for the really inspiring presentation. Do you see a difference when it comes to trust? Do you see differences in building trust and dealing with uncertainty between the hard sciences, life sciences, and social sciences and humanities? Is it different in different areas?
That's a really good question that I must admit I haven't really thought about. I think the principles are always the same. It's a matter of experience. It's a matter of building upon past experiences where things worked well. You build trust over time. But I can't think of critically different issues in these different areas. I have to think about this. It's a good one. I'll take a note.
And there's a comment here from Paul Spiker saying, in the case of COVID, we've been let down by some mainstream research which failed to view problems in context. Example, a well-known RCT of masks criticized by medics for being as appropriate as an RCT. I'm not sure what RCT stands for, but I'm sure you know, of parachute use. However, the fundamental weakness was that the study focused on the benefits to the wearer, not the transmission of disease to others. So that communication issue and how you communicate, also very important. I just wanted to ask you one last question before we close, and it links to what ProRes has all been about. As a scientist and as somebody advising policymakers, do you think currently they ask enough questions of the advice they get and where the evidence comes from, that it has been ethically produced, that it has been produced in a responsible way, with integrity? Or, you know, one of the aims of this project is to get policymakers to ask those questions, and it gives them some tools to do that. How important is that? And do you think now the right questions get asked by policymakers?
I believe, I trust that they do their due diligence when they come to asking advice of experts. So in our case, we're a set up entity, and the procedures are published and transparent, and that should be known to the policymakers. Whether they ask the right or the wrong questions, I guess that's a matter of everyone's taste. Personally, I always think more science, the better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're going to hear more about some of those questions that you might ask of the evidence. What does the guidance framework tell us about that? How does the toolbox help? And I am helpfully informed by Paul, RCT, of course, stands for randomized controlled trial. Nicole, thank you so much for being with us today. I know how busy you are. We are tremendously grateful to you. Thank you very much. And we'll report back on the rest of the day to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I would have enjoyed staying, but we're actually collecting evidence today, so I'm afraid I have to.
There you are. So you're in the business of doing what we're discussing. So thank you so much for finding the time to be with us. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So we want to hear more now about what the ProRes project has produced and the so-called step accord that has emerged from this process. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Emmanuel Detsis, Science Officer at the European Science Foundation, who's going to tell us more about the project, about the framework. Then we're going to get some reactions from distinguished speakers. I'll introduce them later on, and then have a discussion. And again, there will be time for your questions if you have any. So Emmanuel, thank you for having us here today. And over to you to tell us more about the project.
Thank you, Jacki. Good morning from me, and thank you to everyone for attending our conference. Thank you, Professor Grobert, although she already left, for that inspirational and educational speech. I'm very happy to see that she's practicing what we preach, basically. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Just give me a second. I hope you have it now. You can see it.
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. What I'm going to do today is to try to give you an overview of the project and basically mention why we did the project, how we did it, and an overview of what we have actually done. I mean, what are the final deliverables, so to say? What can you get out of the project itself? So the idea of the project was simple: to encourage policymakers and their advisors to seek evidence for their decisions from research that has been conducted ethically and with integrity. As you said in your introduction, and we saw, this is a very important issue. And that was the main reason this project was created. It is funded by the European Commission. And on behalf of the project, I have to thank both the Commission and the Research Executive Agency, because their support throughout the last years have been tremendous, and they have helped us quite a lot. Professor Grobert made very clearly the need for evidence-based policy, and how, and she gave examples of how it is to be done. But allow me please to repeat a couple of points that will highlight why this we also thought that this was an important issue. Ethically sound evidence should have a role in evidence-based policy. I think this is a statement that we can all subscribe to. And the reason is that decision takers and policymakers, they need to be seeking evidence to support their work from the full range of expertise to offer. However, and now we come back to the issue of trust that was so highlighted in the keynote speech. Any errors, fraud, or corrupt practices by the evidence providers or hidden within the evidence itself can now lead to serious damage to the social, economic, and cultural structure of society. And we also add here the physical environment, but also incur a loss of trust, which is paramount, as we heard. Therefore, the evidence needs to be conducted, needs to be provided from sound, reliable, and transparent research. I think these are statements that we can all subscribe to, and this is the what the ideas that we started the project with, and why I'm going to now tell you a little bit how we went about it. The ethical issues that we dealt with within the project went beyond, let's say, human research. We tried to cover all disciplines, and that includes disciplines that deal with the environment, that deal with other issues apart from, let's say, humans participating in research. So we had to include a very wide variety of evidence gatherers. Therefore, we are a consortium that is comprised from partners that have very different expertise. So we try to cover as many areas as possible, and hear voices from around Europe and all over the spectrum of science. We arranged both bottom-up and top-down consultations in order to be able to discuss with everyone, and at the end create a guidance framework that can encourage policymakers and their advisors to seek evidence for their decisions from research that has been conducted ethically, responsibly, and with integrity. So what we try to provide is a structure that can help people that sit on all areas of the policy advice spectrum, from evidence gatherers to evidence providers to people that use evidence for their decisions. So we have provided this supportive structure that is consists primarily from the STEP Accord, and I will tell you a bit later what exactly this means, which is a generic signable statement like Oviedo, Helsinki, and this is the start. But it also contains a list of a range of tools that can help people either understand or apply the accord, and various resources to cover various aspects that are important in this area. So we have provided this framework that can help organizations, but also individuals, to either find tools that they can use in their daily business, or provide educational resources. A further explanation of what you can find, the full range of results of the project, is the step accord that we will see in the next slide, the toolbox that operationalizes the accord, and the resources I've already talked about, but we also include case studies, because we believe in the power of case studies. These are examples of what has happened in the past and what decisions other people have taken and why they were good or bad. This is especially in ethics, where the situations tend to be difficult to unwrap and complicated. Sometimes it's very useful to see how other people have reacted. We have a roadmap on future ethical issues that will probably be coming up for the next decades. We have also tried to be a bit more practical and hands-on, and so there is some economic analysis on how to price trust in order to enhance trustworthy best practices, and I will talk a little bit about this towards the end. We've also included several workshops and interviews. These were with a very wide range of stakeholders, from individual researchers to policymakers to reporters, and discussing both our work, but also some issues that come in their work. And finally, we have, let's say, the scientific output of the project that is contained in 3 open access volumes on key research ethics issues. Now, I am not going to read this. I know it's a very busy slide. I will spare you. I do invite you on our website where you can find this, and you can also find the principles and values behind the statements and why we wrote them as they are. Allow me, though, to highlight a couple of, let's say, not novelties, but very important aspects that we would like to bring to the surface through this accord. This is a generic accord, and it had to be, because, as I said, it tries to cover several disciplines, but it also tries to go beyond scientists giving evidence to policymakers. We enlarged the board when it comes to evidence, and we recognize that in the modern world, it's not only scientists that give evidence, but there are other institutions, other individuals that also provide evidence, and they are not operating under the same procedures as scientists working in let's say, a university. So what we think is important to come out of these statements, that effective policy requires high quality evidence. I think this is self-evident, but at the same time, I would like to remind you that effective policy is also a policy that is taken by the public as well. Not that the policy will have the required effect, but it will be implemented in a good way. The public will accept it, and we have the COVID lessons on how this can go wrong sometimes. We would like to add ethical methods into sound and robust requirements for high quality evidence. So we believe that high quality evidence are necessarily, they need to be ethical. And of course, and it was mentioned also in the keynote speech, transparency is paramount, and that is very important. However, we recognize conflict of interest, and they need to be recognized, but they are not to be rejected. I think practically speaking, it is not possible in this day and age to avoid completely conflict of interest. So therefore, you need recognition rather than rejection. And there are very valid voices when giving evidence that may have a conflict of interest, but they should be heard nevertheless. And of course, we also recognize, again, coming from a pragmatic perspective, that independence of evidence providers or evidence gathering might not be possible in the modern world. There are other organizations apart from scientific institutions, and they may not necessarily be fully independent. However, a reasonable degree of independence is possible and can be recognized, and they too have very valid voices in the evidence gathering process. So, as I said, I'm not going to go through point by point because there is a lot of discussion to be had. I invite you to visit our website for that. From the accord, which is the generic statement, we have created several tools for the people that evaluate, generate, or use evidence. And these are either tools to help operationalize the accord and its principles, such as simple checklist of how to do it or how not to do it. We also have treated the subject of covert research a bit particularly because it was a difficult topic, and admittedly it is not so easy to find information. So we have created its own tool guiding covert research. And since we spend a lot of time dealing with ethical codes and guidelines and integrity codes, we have some recommendations on code building, people that would like to adopt or build their own code or adopt perhaps someone else's. The toolbox.
You can be fairly quick now, Emmanuel.
Yes.
We are running towards the end of time.
No problem. The toolbox, of course, contains a lot of community tools because there has been many other projects before us, and there will be many after us. This is a very active area, so we try to combine and use what has been out there and has been proven useful. Our resources deal with several issues, and it's very numerous to name, but they deal, for example, with data, how to do ethics reviews, educational and training materials. So anything that someone can use that either they want to educate themselves or they want to learn something about a particular topic. And as I said, a showcase of 3 of the books, the 3 open access volumes that we will be putting on the website soon. They are now with the publisher, and hopefully the chapter soon will be available. And these are in-depth analysis of the issues. You see here the topics. I will talk a little bit on one of the volumes. So you see the table of contents here, the ethical evidence on policymaking, where we treat various topics that are general on the field. We focus on particular issues as well, GM foods, AI, and other areas that have particularities. So we go in depth there, and we also treat institutional and organizational matters as well regarding ethics. As you say, there are 18 chapters from various researchers, not all from ProRes. We had guest writers here as well. And I will conclude, Jacki, just to say that we also had a more hands-on approach on trust. We tried to put a value in it, basically. We started with a wide survey on trust in the knowledge economy, what this is. Admittedly, this happened before COVID, so perhaps this should be taken into account. And what we saw that there is a significant expectation for transparency from the public, and not only that, but there seems to be a request for a tool to strengthen confidence in the knowledge economy by giving greater visibility to tracking down the misuse of research results, data sourcing, and social legitimacy of the research innovation carried out. And this tool, we were not able to produce it because we were not geared up for it, and we were kind of surprised on the conclusion. but the public would like something that allows it to be interactively involved in the process. So something like a trust recommender or indicator seems to be missing. And finally, a work that is just now finished and will be put on the website. We tried to put a price on trust, and more specifically, a price on the failure of trust, an impact-based approach to the demonstration that inadequate use of research outputs come with an economic cost. And this is essentially an effort to create a tool that allows to decide whether or not to continue a project in case of fraud or misbehavior.
Okay.
And that's my last slide, Jacki, and that can be useful for certain people that fund or need to measure the impact of projects. So this is the last of my presentation. I'm sorry I went too fast. There are too many issues to mention, but I do invite you to visit us on the web address you see here, and I give the floor back to you now.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Thank you for taking us through such in-depth work, so many products of this project, so many things to discuss in such a lightning way. It was brilliant. And apologies for cutting you slightly short at the end. I just want time for people to ask their questions and for us to discuss it. So if you do have questions, ladies and gentlemen, remember Q&A box or raise your hand. But we have invited 3 people. We wanted to get different perspectives on the Accord and on the accompanying toolbox and resources we've heard about, a policy perspective, an academic perspective, and a publisher's perspective. So joining us for that, and if I could ask them to turn their cameras on, they're already doing so. I'm delighted to welcome Yves Dumont, a policy officer in the European Commission's Directorate General for Research and Innovation. For an academic perspective, from Dr. Su-Ming Khoo, who is a senior lecturer at the National University of Ireland in Galway. And for a publisher's perspective, Dr. Sabina, Director of Publishing Ethics and Integrity at the Taylor and Francis Group, which is a publisher of books and academic journals. So a very warm welcome to all of you. I've asked each of you to react to the presentation, to the outcome of this project in just 3 or 4 minutes each. And then I will have some questions for you and our audience too. And please do get those questions coming in. So let's get started. And Yves, a driver behind this whole thing from the Commission perspective, thank you so much for being here. Your reaction to the outcome of the project?
Well, first of all, good morning to everybody, and thank you, Emmanuel, for this very thorough and clear presentation of the project, of a rich project outcome. I think first I would like to underline that ProRes is the first project of its kind as regard the EU framework program. We have been financed since FP5. Loads of projects on ethics, on different technologies in different fields, build network of organizations, develop educational material and training, but no project had yet touched the ethics of the science advice process. So as it has been presented with this STEP Accord, scientists are now invited to respect ethics and integrity principle beyond the production of knowledge. That is really the added value of ProRes framework and of the STEP Accord in particular. So beyond the ethics of research, we are now targeting the ethics of the use of research results in policy context. Also, the content of the Accord, as Emmanuel stated, is generic. It is focusing on essential principles because this was the objective, and it is thereby acceptable by all fields and all disciplines, and not only in normal conditions, because it is even more pertinent as we have witnessed this last months, and even more during crisis, where the risks of unethical practices might increase. So urgency, fair enough, can lead because of the shorter time frame, as it was underlined in the keynote speech, to adapted methodology, but it can't lead to poor quality or biased results. because the whole purpose is defeated and the trust is lost. As regard the impact of the accord, we should be reasonable, patient in terms of expectation. It's obvious that independent of the quality, an accord, or more globally the framework, is not going to transform the way science advice is conducted in the EU. But it is a first building block, and the first impact is to be measured in terms of increased awareness. So approaching individual and organizations to discuss the accord is an effective way of launching an internal discussions, reflections within those organizations, and hopefully to trigger an adaptation of the procedure. A signature, there will be signatories, does not mean that there will be an actual impact if there is no commitment to implement the principles. There are so many examples in history of treaties or charters locked in cupboards. It is only that increased awareness followed by a progressive adaptation of the culture, because the management adopt new ways of approaching things, and then progressively the procedure that will make a difference. Interaction with those that are to implement the accord is also a way to collect their feedback and to understand how the document could be either complemented or fine-tuned. We see that as a dynamic process. The accord should not be seen as something which is written in stone, and we expect that the document could evolve based on the feedback coming from those implementing it, from the implementation. This, of course, necessitates a very careful process, a collective, a constructive one, which is involving all the signatories to maintain the adhesion. So that is how we see things for the future of progress.
Thank you very much indeed, and lots to discuss there. As you say, this first building block, how do we build that iterative process that goes on, refining it, adapting it? We'll come back, I hope, in our discussion to that, but let's continue to get reactions. Dr. Su-Ming, your thoughts?
Okay, so my very quick reflections, thanks very much, Jacki, reflect on co-editing 4 books in very rapid time frame with Dr. Helen Kara, who I met in the context of the project workshops. So the books are on doing research in times of crises, and they involve about 120 global contributors. So they have given us a kind of a broad canvas for thinking about the accord in this context and in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, which points to very major existential problems for research and evidence, which are associated with a crisis of what you call normal science. Yeah. So informing decisions with evidence becomes very challenging in a pandemic crisis that is not just a crisis of global health, but is also simultaneously a knowledge crisis with infodemics and harmful public action challenging conventional scientific view. So how can we do research for society to build back better amidst this destabilized knowledge? Because science seems to be really more essential than ever, but it also seems much more limited and powerless. So it's almost as if the science society contract seems to be weak or even falling apart, requiring a refreshed or renewed covenant to address questions of academic freedom, public needs, and democracy. So this accord, which centers ethical foundations and discusses methods, tools, and examples, is, in my view, a very generative response that steers the research public interaction or nexus away from these trends of what we would call epistemic nihilism, assumptions that no views have any intrinsic value, and epistemic cynicism, the distortion of views for instrumental reasons of power. Now, there have been in the researchers' domain some pushback against ethical regulation, arguing that it should be left to the scientists. But of course, this lesson from COVID-19 for the range of disciplines is that the normal science disciplinary approach to knowledge is not sufficient. If you think about successful pandemic management, for example, the examples like Taiwan, for example, take this post-normal science and society approach, which is more collaborative, carefully nurturing trust, investing in participation, and maximizing transparency. So, but at the same time, these reflect also the necessity for trust in public goods and good quality public goods, the robust health systems that are capable of coordinated response and effective measures of isolation, use of digital information, mask use, and so on. So this ProRes, in my view, represents a valuable step beyond an ad hoc approach from within the sciences to a broader approach without forcing technocratic regulation. So the supportive framework idea, which is about strengthening capacities for ethical discussion and judgment and widening the collegial circle of ethical practice, bringing not just ethical research evidence into policy advising, but ethics all the way down and ethics all the way across, creating more structured communication about different projects, seeding a community of practice, which is focused on research ethics and integrity, using the shared tools, the conversations, and greater awareness of each other's efforts. But we need to recognize that this ground has shifted very significantly since the scientists first pushed back against prescriptive ethical regulation, because scientific principles and researcher autonomy and collegiality have been eroded by what is happening in academia generally, new public management, competition, privatization, commercialization of research and education. All of these trends aid and abet the dispositions towards epistemic nihilism and epistemic cynicism. And these have been further exacerbated by disinformation and agnotological trends of created ignorance, undermining the public attitudes towards science, education, and research, and contributing to an existential crisis for science, information, and democracy itself. So just to wrap up my couple of minutes, returning to what Helen and I learned from our collaborative books projects on doing research in times of crisis, we observed how current fast crises act by placing a magnifying glass on longer term, slow structural crises of harm and injustice. So in the context of these longer term crises, responses to crises require care and resilience and ethical creativity, not just for the researchers and the scientists, but for everyone involved. So a crisis epistemology drawing on the philosophical interventions of indigenous philosophers and scientists, crisis epistemology is something to be avoided because it mobilizes the presumptions of urgency and novelty to elide and reproduce and fail to account for or dismantle structural injustices. So alternatively, research ethics can learn with humility from what the indigenous philosophers call epistemologies of coordination, indigenous ways of knowing the world that emphasize moral bonds while generating responsible capacities to respond to change without validating or reproducing harm or violence. So I believe that epistemologies of coordination are what this research ethics community should seek to achieve through the STEP Accord resources, tools, and discussions.
Thank you very much indeed. Fascinating stuff and lots to come back to, I hope, in our conversation afterwards. And don't forget, if you have any questions for any of our speakers, please use the Q&A box or click the raise hands button. Let's get a publishing perspective now from Sabina Alam. Dr. Alam, very warm welcome to you. Your reaction to the outcome of this project, to the Accord.
Great, thank you very much, Jackie. And also thank you to Emmanuel for walking us through So much information, there's so much great work that has happened here. So from a publisher's perspective, I can just take a moment to describe what we do in order to sort of put the perspective of what this accord means to us. So at Taylor & Francis, we publish journals, well, as you said, books as well. I'm mainly talking from a journals perspective across all the different disciplines. So it's all humanities, social sciences, but also medicine, health, life sciences, et cetera, et cetera. So when I was going through the accord and the toolbox, I wasn't really necessarily distinguishing between medical and non-medical research, because really to us, all of the research we're publishing needs to be trustworthy. So as publishers, obviously we have that responsibility in ensuring that whatever we're disseminating, whatever we're publishing in our journals, our peer-reviewed journals, has passed a set of checks and balances so that we can stand behind saying, this is trustworthy content, this is different from a preprint, it's different from, you know, something posted on someone's blog, it's a validated, vetted piece of research. So what do we do? How do we measure that? So firstly, obviously it's a selection of the peer reviewers, but then there are also some things that we also need to check from an editorial perspective to look at some of these key elements that could possibly introduce bias or actually require transparency from the point of view of readers. So things like competing interests. I completely agree with what Emmanuel said, that existence of competing interest doesn't mean, you know, we shouldn't consider the work or publish the work. It's really just about transparency. Funding statements, author contributions, all of that kind of thing, but also the ethics statements. So we look at who has approved the study. So who is responsible for having vetted the ethical study design? Who is, and is that from an appropriate body? Particularly important when you have multi-site collaborations between different between different research groups. So checking, has this ethical approval procedure been appropriate? And authors need to state that. Looking at the consent procedure as well, and I particularly welcome from what Emmanuel showed us about giving specific guidance on covert research, because this is a really, really tricky area. And when we advise editors or authors in terms of what standards need to be maintained, like Emmanuel said, there's not a lot of information out there. And I think this is a really, really important piece that has been included within the STEP Accord project. The other aspect that we deal with all the time is when it comes to ethical approval, what is sort of deemed ethical is also shifting. So how we define different vulnerable groups is also changing and evolving as we ourselves get much better at, you know, understanding maybe some of the political makeup in different settings and how that may change. What is deemed an ethical study design in one setting versus another, what is deemed as a appropriate route of getting informed consent from one setting versus another, and so on. So it's a very, very varied atmosphere, and something that we are always talking to our editors about in terms of really not just going through a checklist to say, yes, there's a statement there, it's there, but to really, really focus on a case-by-case basis in terms of what the research is, where the setting is, who is responsible for the funding, for example, has everything that needs to be declared been declared. And another challenge is also around data sharing. So as we move more towards increasing trust, we also are moving more towards asking authors, editors, you know, to put data sharing policies on their journals. And that's something that Taylor & Francis supports as well. But again, there we need to be really, really mindful of the challenges about that, not just from data management perspective, but in terms of the ethical sharing of the data and what role do we as publishers have. And I noticed within the toolbox, there's some really useful guidance and resources around that as well. And really just
briefly now, if you would, Sabina.
Yes, absolutely. So just to kind of, as an example, we've seen this all play out in the COVID aspect, but also where the COVID challenges have met the challenges with trust in vaccinations, vaccination research as well. And this is again where publishers have come into play in terms of trying to distinguish good between not so good when we look at these kinds of ethics statements that we want to focus on. So coming to the STEP Accord protocol, I think
it's going to have to be quick now, Sabina. Sorry.
I'm finishing off, Jacki. So basically, for us, really, the key to this, and this is to pick up on Yves' point, is understanding the toolbox, understanding the implications. What do we need to take away and work with our editors and reviewers on? And actually, that was something maybe might be a little bit missing in here at the moment. You do mention publishers, but maybe there's something additionally we can do specifically guided towards editors, reviewers, publishers, and how to interpret these beyond the reappraise tool to make something meaningful out of this. I'm finished now, Jacki.
Thank you. Sorry, you're all raising so many interesting issues I would like to discuss, and we do see some questions coming in from our audience. And you were talking there, Sabina, at the end about understanding the toolbox and about maybe some specificities. I just wanted to ask each of you, in terms of the implementation challenge ahead, you've all underlined how, and as Yves said, groundbreaking, very different, but how do you see it being applied? Sabina, you talked, come to you first on that one, about the principles and the mechanisms that you currently use. How do you see its application in your context? Same question to all three of you.
So for us, how I would envision it at the moment is where we have some kind of triage checklist, for editors or reviewers or whoever is doing kind of a desk assessment, to actually have this as a complementary set of guidance in terms of what to look for. I think checklists are great, but you need to understand what you're looking for and how that might impact the decision on a particular paper. So I would see this in a particular, like the case studies that are included in the toolbox, as a way of us helping to add to the resources, like the training resources that we provide for editors and reviewers. Reviewers are really important here as well, to actually implement some of this guidance that has forward by step forward.
And as you say, then looking at it for your own sector, for different sectors, and how it needs to be adapted and adjusted. Same question to you, Su-Ming. You talked about it being a valuable step from, as you said, that ad hoc approach to something much more systemic without becoming too prescriptive and so on. How do you see the challenge ahead to implement it effectively?
So yeah, absolutely. I think it's about it's avoiding that very top-down regulatory approach, which won't work with the scientists anyway, because that's what they've already, said outright, that they don't want that. So taking the form of this forum for discussing and applying various ethical principles. So I asked myself this in relation to my own practice as my own professional practice as an educator of early career researchers. So what would I do with this toolbox? So to start with a forum of discussion. So we are using the glossary in the resources, and we're going to have 5-minute coffee chats with the early career and active researchers, talking about the keywords to start the conversation, because this is not something that can be finished easily, but I think it's very much about building community and building, using the framework of supports to build a community who's interested in having ethics all the way down and all the way across in their research practice.
Absolutely. And that links very much, Yves, to what you said at the beginning, because you said approaching organizations to discuss the accord is part of that awareness raising, is part of that starting the conversation. How do you see the way ahead now to begin that conversation? You said it's a first building block. What are going to be the second, third, fourth building blocks, if you like, to translate this from words to action?
Well, I think to underline it again, what matters the most is really to not only to disseminate the idea, but to disseminate it effectively, this accord. I mean, through networks that are not just welcoming, but that will be ready to actively relay the importance of the objectives. So the objectives of using in a wise way the research results, and to go well beyond the nice declarations, the shaking hands, and the signature. So in order to contribute to this take-up, the Commission notably proposed that the accord and the framework would be presented by the ProRes team to one of the forthcoming meeting of the NEC Forum, which is the network of the National Ethics Councils. That would be also asked themselves to disseminate and raise awareness in their country about the need to promote adherence to those ethics principles in policy processes. Another very practical way is also that to further contribute would be for the Commission to see how the STEP Accord could be referenced in the Horizon Europe guidelines, because we have so many people reading our documents when they prepare their proposal, that we can also pass on the message. If you are embarked into science advice processes, there are key principles and rules and resources that you can base yourself upon, and here is what ProRes produced. So, well, it's not very much beyond step one, I'm afraid, but it might be a little bit early to identify the following one. Sorry for not being so visionary as you would expect.
Thank you. And Emmanuel, if I could come back to you, because you talked when you were presenting the framework, you said the accord is deliberately generic. You wanted to cover a range of disciplines and go beyond the scientists, as you say, to this focus on evidence for policymakers. How did you resolve the sort of getting the balance between concreteness, keeping it short, keeping it user-friendly, and so on, and general enough to cover all these different areas, but still specific enough to be genuinely useful? Because we heard Sabina saying, you know, she would like to see perhaps something more specific for her area of work. How did you strike that balance, and how do you see taking that process forward now?
To answer very succinctly, with a lot of revisions and a lot of discussion. What I think the accord went through 15 iterations. I would say we started with 15 statements, then we went down to 4, then we expanded again. What we tried to do was include everyone, basically do as we preach. We try to have as many inputs as possible, and at the same time, once we had an opposite view, especially I would like to highlight the difference between scientific institutions and other institutions that provide evidence, because they don't operate under the same principles. And we had this discussion between them on, you know, what is the consensus, what is a statement that would be acceptable by all. And through this process, an iterative bottom-up process, we hope that we arrived at a place where everyone can find something that is useful, albeit on the generic level. And as for the tools, we are always open to identifying what furthermore can we do, because the tools can be specific. There is no problem there.
Yeah. I wanted to also link this conversation to the COVID and to what Dr. Khoo was saying about the knowledge crisis that we face. Tamsin McLeod from our audience talks about, throughout COVID, some governments have been criticizing for waiting too long on the evidence to act, for example, on face masks. Is there a risk that in creating too many hoops for research to jump over, for example, excessive review, the STEP Accord's objective of effective outcomes is hindered? Emmanuel, this project, as you say, began before COVID. It's not just about crisis response. It's about, sort of, if you like the term used in the title, permanent crisis. We live in an age of multiple challenges all the time. But is there a risk that you create too many hurdles?
I don't want to view it as a hurdle. And if you allow me, I will answer with an analogy from a completely different subject. When you have a crisis, it's your reflexes that matter. You don't have time to think very much. You are acting. So if you wait until the crisis is hitting, basically people are dying in the streets, right? Then it's a bit too late to go download an ethical checklist and go through the checklist saying, have I made sure that everything is here? What you should have done is to have this as an integrated reflex to the process. So my inappropriate analogies, when I was younger, I went parachuting. And the first day I was in a room and the only thing I did was check here, pull down, pull this, do one motion for 5 hours. At the time, I did not understand why I should have to do this. It's ridiculous. It's just a simple motion. You just pull the parachute and it opens. 5 hours we drilled this. When I went in the plane, they opened the door, they sat me next to the plane and I froze. I was really very scared. It was flying, it was very high. And when I fall off the plane, I automatically did it because it had
become instinctive.
It's a reflex. So
very good.
The value of progress, therefore, lies in the education of researchers and policymakers before the crisis to be doing these steps. And when the time that the crisis arrives, they would know how to do it.
Thank you. And Yves, if I could come back to you on what you talked about, the progressive adaptation of culture, and you talked about seeing this as a dynamic process that needs to be fine-tuned. Do you believe it is designed in a way, the Accord, that fine-tuning, that updating, and we've heard, things change, and we heard very graphically from Dr. Khoo there, how dramatically things have changed, particularly in the context of COVID. But how do you see that dynamic process? And do you believe the Accord has been designed really to make sure that can happen?
I believe so. I believe that the fact of having general principles helps you to have a good start in the discussion that you have with the people that have to implement it. And as I said, I believe that the feedback they will have when they will encounter practical difficulties talking to their scientists, the different labs and sub-organizations in the case of big international organizations, they will receive comments. I mean, how do you want me to operationalize this? And if they don't have the answer, they might come back and say, well, we were very enthusiastic, but this is not enough. I mean, it's not these general principles that will enable the people down the road to do it. So this is really this interaction, but you have to start somewhere. And if you have too long lists, as Emmanuel said, then you can't communicate. Absolutely. If you have too short one, there is no message. So they struck a relatively good balance, I believe. And the feedback mechanism is going to be part of this fine-tuning process.
And Su-Ming, you talked about we need to recognize that the ground has shifted very significantly, you said towards the end of your remarks. Do you believe, looking at the Accord, that you want to move from the ad hoc to something more systematic, but that balance of getting away from being ad hoc, making it an instinct that Emmanuel talked about, but nevertheless with that flexibility to adapt and change when the ground shifts again?
Yeah, so the key to this, I think, is the principled approach. So one of the things when the scientists rejected ethical regulation, they also rejected, about 10 years ago, they also rejected the principled approach. They said, well, this is ethical enthusiasm and we don't need these Belmont principles and so on. But actually the principles are simple. And when Emmanuel is talking about his ethical know-how, so it's developing this ethical know-how of pulling the cord, well, that ethical know-how is rooted in a principle, the principle of the preservation of life. Yeah, so this is non-harming, non-maleficence, and the principle of beneficence. And so that is the thing that comes with the research, with the evidence integrity and the researcher integrity and the care and treatment of research respondents and consideration of the consequences of the advice that you're going to give. So I think that ethics all the way down is about principles and the principled approach, and that's not difficult to understand, because even when you're standing on the edge of the airplane and you're not sure whether you're going to know whether to pull the cord or not, that principle is going to stand behind the know-how of how to pull the cord. Absolutely. So it's really bringing people up in that kind of mentality where there is, even in this terrible indeterminacy and crisis that is ongoing. So what we really learned is that in a way, there's something very new about the crisis, but also in another way, there's not very much new about it. We've had crises, many crises before. So it's, how do we know how to act in coordinated ways that are not going to reproduce harm and are going to, reduce harm?
Yeah. Sabine, a quick one, if you would, in terms of this flexibility, this dynamism of the process.
So I absolutely agree with everything that's just been said on that, because even for us, the getting the principles right is step number one, because often we do have to adapt and adapt quickly. Like the COVID was actually one of those types of situations where there's this pressure, publish it fast, but without dropping standards. So you really need to know what the core principles are before you adapt that way, and guide editors and reviewers.
Absolutely.
But also readers need to know if we are changing anything in the way that we're disseminating information. For example, if it's gone through an expedited process, to be aware of that as well. I would agree with all of that. It carries all the way through right to the publication step.
Thank you. Very quick one, Emmanuel, from our audience, from Lars Broses, who says the social legitimacy of evidence-based policy prescriptions seems to be the crucial factor here. Do we have evidence about the impact of high quality evidence on social legitimacy? A quick one, if you would, Emmanuel, because then I want to try and draw some conclusions.
I'm going to be very quick. I'm not an expert there, so I cannot answer. Perhaps one of the consortium partners can provide the answer. I would just say that we saw the same thing in our survey, that people need to have this indicator of the social legitimacy. It seems to be, as the audience said, it's a key issue.
It's a demand that is coming stronger and stronger. And just a comment from Robert Dingwall, who says ProRes has been trying to talk about ethics regulation rather than ethical regulation. We need to keep the distinction so we can talk about unethical conduct by ethics regulators. We are almost out of time. I just want to put each of you on the spot and ask you for each of you, and I will go the reverse way to the first question. So I'll go Sabina, I'll go Su-Ming, I'll go Yves, and then Emmanuel. For each of you, in a sentence, key next step to build on what's been done and really translate this accord into action. What for each of you is the key next thing we need to do? Sabina.
The next step would be actually to work on the toolbox to actually distill some of that specific advice that we can relate directly to editors, authors, reviewers, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Su-Ming.
I'd say to seed and grow researchers' own ethical creativity.
Thank you. Yves. You're muted, Yves.
I'd simply say pass on the message.
That awareness raising, that beginning the conversation that we've been talking about is so important. And Emmanuel, I know it's impossible after all the hard work to distill out of this one key next step, but where for you do we go from here? And it's something we're going to discuss with our next panel after the break.
I think we need to find a way to have a continuous discursive engagement with the project. Ethics is a field that shifts and changes, and the discussion needs to remain open. There should be ways for a permanent discussion and re-evaluation.
Thank you. So this project is coming to its end. Will end at the end of next month, but this is the start of that permanent evaluation, that permanent conversation. Panel, thank you so much for a great discussion. I wish we had twice the time. Lots of things I'd love to have discussed with you, but we're going to look in our next session at the way ahead. Where do we go from here? How do we translate what we've heard about into practice, get some more perspectives on that. So thank you so much, Emmanuel, for presenting the project, and to all of the team on ProRes for the work you've done. And thank you, Sabina, Su-Ming, and Yves for a fantastic conversation. We're going to take a 15-minute break. And then, as I say, we're going to come back to talk about the road ahead. So don't go away, grab a coffee, and I look forward to seeing you back here in 15 minutes. Thank you very much, panel.
Thank you, Jacki.
Thank you very much, Jacki.
Going to restart in a couple of minutes. So if you can hear me, please, if you could return to your desks or wherever you're watching this from, we will get underway in a couple of minutes. Okay, we're going to get underway in just a moment. So if I could ask you, please, to return to your seats if you have left them. Okay, I suggest that we get underway again. So a very warm welcome back to this second session of our final conference today of the ProRes project, where we're going to focus, as I said before the break, on evidence-based policy making and advice, the road ahead. And so in order to do this, let me introduce our wonderful panel. I'm delighted to welcome David Mair, who is Head of Unit for Knowledge for Policy at the Joint Research Centre at the European Commission. Also Roger Casale, Executive Director of the New Europeans, a civil society organisation, and he's a former Member of Parliament in the UK. Warm welcome to you. Dr. Gabi Lombardo, Director of the European Alliance of Social Sciences, and Dr. Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive of the European Policy Centre. A very warm welcome to you all. In this session, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to have a totally interactive discussion based on some questions from me to our panel, but then also, I hope, from all of you. So just a reminder, Q&A box if you want to write it, or click on the raise hand button, and I will allow you to talk when the time comes. Roger, I seem to have lost you momentarily. You're back. Super. So a very warm welcome to all of you. And in our first session, we heard why this issue, why this topic that the ProRes project sought to address is so important, and particularly in the context where we are now. An era, as the title of the event said, of what you might call permanent crisis, but also some of those lessons that we've learned from COVID, but very much stressing this isn't about just a response to COVID. This is about a long-term approach to addressing these issues. We heard what's in the accord, what's in the accompanying toolbox and resources. And we began to discuss, where do we go from here? The implementation challenge ahead, how does it apply to different sectors? How do we keep that dynamism, that flexibility that is built into the process? So lots to talk about, but let me start, if I might, and David, start with you at first base, before we come to the specifics of the accord and where we go from here. From your perspective, and I know you've done some publications at the JRC in these areas, what do you see as the most important challenges in our current environment to ensure that policy making is based on ethically sound, reliable, transparent research?
Thank you very much, Jacki, and thanks for this opportunity. So I'm lucky enough to work for the Joint Research Centre, the Science and Knowledge Service of the European Commission. Our job is to bring science into EU policy processes. And of course, we see the challenges that the framework, the toolkit is trying to solve, because we are not going to solve the challenges that Europe faces without a massive injection of science to help us understand these complex problems and come up with solutions. And I like very much the Accord and Toolkit and what you say there. I think this is necessary, indispensable even, but it's just not sufficient. So the work that we are doing are looking at some of the other conditions that we think need to be tackled if the science is actually to be brought to bear on the policy making. And I think there are two big areas we're looking at. The first one, and we have a report coming out on this in November, is the question of values and identities. Science itself is not value free. Researchers choose their topics on the basis of value judgments. And more importantly, this idea we have of first, let's get the facts straight, let's get the science straight, and then we'll work out what we're going to do with it. This, unfortunately, is not how human beings think. Our values, our identities, and our worldviews, they not only drive what we think about what should be done about these issues, they also feed back into, they bleed back into how we see the science. So all of us, when we're faced by science that challenges our worldview, we get busy trying to knock down the science. So we have to recognize this by understanding better the values and identities of people. And the second thing where I think we're going to need to work on is to open up the scientific process and the choices, the research choices that are made to citizens and their different values to those of the scientists, if we want to build this trust. And that's what it's all about. I know Nicole mentioned trust earlier today. The great mistake scientists make is thinking that trust is only about excellence or only about transparency. But what we know from the science of trust, it's also about there being a community of values between the people who you want to find the trust from. So that's the other big topic.
Thank you. Lots to come back to in our discussion. And as you say, trust very much at the heart of what Nicole Grobert said at the beginning. And she was talking about trust between scientists, between the scientist and the policymaker, and then with the broader public. We'll come back on that a bit later on. Roger Casale, very warm welcome. Thank you for being with us. And you can sit and look at this from different perspectives. Now a civil society organization, previously a politician. We've been talking about politicians and how they receive advice and the questions they should be asking of the advice that they get, the science and the evidence behind it. How do you see the challenge in our current political environment in addressing those issues?
Thank you very much indeed, Jacki. And yes, that's right. I'm a civil society activist now. But previously I was a politician, and I think you want me to, think you're inviting me to speak from the moral low ground of...
You're on the high end. I would never say the low ground.
So I will do my best. I think the biggest challenge, as I see it today for this endeavor is that politicians lie. I mean, we're in an age where politicians lie. I was a politician a long time ago, as you may remember. I think so 16 years since I was an active politician. And in my day, you weren't, lying was the one thing that you couldn't do. You could be, as the phrase was, economical with the truth, but you telling a straight lie would be a red card. That doesn't seem to be the case today. We heard from Dr. Su-Ming earlier about, I think she used the phrase epistemic nihilism or epistemic cynicism, but actually I think we've got the epistemic nightmare right now, because which is that, you know, politicians lie. And of course that picks up the point that David was making about trust. Why should you trust somebody who lies to you? I think lying is the biggest challenge in the political world today, as I see it, closely followed by politicians who don't listen. Not only do we have politicians who lie, we have politicians who don't listen. And we also have politicians who don't learn. And it's not just a question of not learning, it's also, let's remember that, you know, how old was I? I was 36, 37, I think, when I first became an MP. We do have younger MPs today, which is a good thing, because it means that they got their masters or their PhD or their BA just a few years ago, and they're methodological and theoretical background is not so out of date, but I think you know, politicians have got out of the habit of being able to think critically. And I do like the title of this session, evidence-based policymaking. But you know, we also need intelligence-based policymaking. We don't just need trustworthy evidence. We also need politicians who know how to think straight, and I think we've lost that habit as well. Can this help the Accord? Well, I want to be positive, and I'm really delighted and honoured to be part of this discussion, and I do think that widening the discussion is going to be the key. But I think we need to calibrate our expectations about how helpful it is, but it's certainly a step, perhaps a small step, in the right direction.
Let's talk about how we make it bigger steps in the right direction. But Gabi and Fabian, coming to you now, very involved in this project, both of you. In terms of the challenge, I mean, David said, you absolutely, the challenge that you've been trying to resolve through this framework is clear, is stark, and he presented some of the issues that need to be addressed. I want to come back on this point about politicians later on, because we have been trying to say this is in the interests of politicians and policymakers, that the evidence that they're using, they can show that it is ethically based. Do they care enough? And if they don't, how do we make them care? Gabi, from your perspective, what is the key challenge?
Thanks, Jacki, and thanks for having me here. I'm part of the project, so I'm very biased in the sense of the achievement of this project. But actually, one of the things, a very interesting journey that we did in ProRes was to start with the assumption that we were looking at how make sure the evidence produced in the scientific world, non-medical disciplines, scientific world, were ethically sounded. And as we went by, and particularly in an effort that we did with and several stakeholders, of which publisher like Taylor and Francis were, or other journalists, for example, participate, we realized that actually we are in a completely different zone, where this famous knowledge society, we often talk about it, they actually knowledge providers are not just the scientists, and those who actually feed back to the policymakers are not just the scientists, actually quite often are not. There are lots of translators, science communicators, there's whole range of people who very disciplined work on the evidence. But there's a transition. So the process of knowledge providing and knowledge making and knowledge productions, they're all stages which happen in very different environments and not just in the scientific environment. This is quite important because obviously the discussion around trust obviously expand enormously. Having some tools that bring people to certain standards, they become crucial, obviously. And so ProRes in that sense, I think, has been doing quite a lot of work to achieve that. And it's not easy, and it's an evolving process. I think this is one of the issues. The other one of the issues in terms of building trust, I said once in a conference, actually with JRC, I think policymakers should cite their sources. That will build trust, the transparency of where do you get the information from, even if you get it from a think tank or a civil society organization, which has an agenda, it's transparent. At least you know what the pathway to policy making, or the pathway from knowledge, from evidence to policy making is. I think we really need to insist on that if you want to build a trust and a community, as David was saying earlier, a community of trust.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And Fabian, picking up there on Gabi's point about, we're not just talking about, it's not just scientists, it's people producing, making knowledge. It happens in different environments, different ways. Think tanks and other non-academic research organizations have particular challenges. How do you see the challenge, and why this initiative matters so much right now?
I think one of the key things we have done with this project is really to expand what we're looking at, that we're not just looking at the academic sector, that we're not just looking at what universities do, but that we look further to all of these different providers of analysis, of advice, including think tanks, but also, for example, consultancies, the whole range of people involved, because there was a recognition from the beginning that that sector is rather influential, but it's not really regulated. There's no real consistency in the approach which is taken there. And there are a number of structural factors which mean that that non-academic sector also has very different incentives in terms of how it engages with ethical guidelines, whether it follows them or not. So what we have done in the process of ProRes, and I think this is the key thing which we need to now take forward, is we have developed something which should also be applicable to that wide range of non-academic analysis providers. But we've also thought about what are the kind of incentives which can be put in place so that this is actually applied. Because in reality, there is not going to be a top-down approach which can regulate this. You cannot go and just say to these non-academic providers, you will have to do X, Y, or Z. Because they are not working in that kind of sector where you can enforce that. So you have to create incentives, you have to make it worthwhile for them. They need to see the benefit. That has something to do with how policymakers work with this sector, but it also has something to do with the structures, with the way this sector is organized. So that's something I think when we're talking about next steps, that will be crucial to make this a success also in that sector.
Absolutely. David, if I could come back to you, Fabian saying there on the ProRes project, arguing very clearly, look, what we are proposing here is in the interest of those who provide the evidence to show it is reliable and trustworthy and it's been ethically generated, and it's in the interest of those who make policy to know that the decision takers, that evidence has been generated in a way the public can trust and in the best possible way. But is it always so self-evident that it is in their self-interest? Picking up on that point Fabian just made, he said it can't be top down. Do you think there needs to be more debate, more convincing that we need this sort of framework, we need these principles before we then move to the next steps in applying it?
I think there is certainly a job to explain the logic behind this and persuade people to invest in the time and trouble to follow it and to comply with it, to monitor it and enforce it, because we've got where we are without these sorts of frameworks. So I don't think they're going to naturally occur. So I think more work does need to go into this. I don't speak for a research funding organization or DG Research, but this is certainly something that all research funders need to look into and make sure they take into account. Because if there are not structural incentives in place within the research system, within the system of career progression of researchers and scientists, then I don't think it's going to happen. It's a perennial problem that we face in trying to persuade and encourage scientists to think about the policy impact of their work, is they say that that's all very well, but there are no structural incentives within the research community to do this. So this is something I do as a hobby in the evenings and the weekends. And this is not going to get me appointed professor and get tenure if I spend all my time trying to think about policy implications rather than trying to get the next publication with some novel findings. So these sort of structural issues about incentives in the research community are certainly something that requires further reflection.
Thank you. And I'd like some thoughts on what might work if it's different for different sectors. But you were talking about incentives in the research community. Roger, incentives in the political world, in the policy world. It should be self-evident that if you want to reassure the public that what you're doing is the correct course of action, that you can reassure them that the evidence that you've used to come to your conclusions has been produced ethically with integrity. But based on what you said earlier and what we know, that isn't always the case. How do we incentivize the politician, the policymaker, to recognize the importance of this?
Thank you, Jacki. It's a fabulous question. And yes, in terms of what I said earlier, just very briefly, I thought I might be challenged on that. I'm certainly not suggesting that all politicians are liars. In fact, I'm based in Italy now, and nobody's ever heard a politician lie. In Italy, you might have thought that it was a little bit conditioned by what had happened when I was in Britain. But some politicians lie, and of course that damages trust and credibility for the whole system. And it's very, very damaging for the system as a whole. And how do we know who is lying and who isn't lying? But you ask about an incentive. I think the incentive is to avoid the potentially catastrophic consequences of policy that is not evidence-based. I would point to that rather than necessarily helping politicians to sell their policies. I think we only need to think about for example, we've just had the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, and that I look back at the 9/11 report at the time of the Twin Tower bombings, and there was catastrophic intelligence failure at the time that made them not pick that up. Think of the crises, we talk about the COVID crisis, what about the financial crisis of 2008? And, you know, the costs of Afghanistan, you know, just imagine, I think as the American satirist Bill Maher said, you know, how many trillions of dollars that was. Just imagine how many billionaires we could have put into space with that kind of money. Or, you know, I think the consequences of policies that are not evidence-based are particularly very dire. So I think this is a way of building trust, as David said, and later perhaps say a bit more about that. I think it's important that not just that the public trusts the politicians, but that the politicians trust the public. And I'll have something more to say about that later on. But I think this is also a way to de-risk policy making, because the consequences of bad policy making can be absolutely dire.
Thank you very much. Gabi, from your perspective, and in terms of incentivizing people, as I say, you make the argument very clearly in the project, this is in everyone's interest, but we're hearing here that you do require incentives in order for people to do it. They won't just see, to build your community of trust, they won't just say, oh yes, this is how we do it, this is why it's so important. Do you believe it can happen organically, or are we going to need to look much more closely at this question of incentives?
Well, we definitely need to work in a systemic way in the different elements. We learned a lot, for example, from a recent workshop about journalists and how they build a little network of trust for the evidence. They only trust certain academics, they go along to, but you can only do if you've been doing journalism for a long time, for example. If you are freelance and you have to sell your article quickly, you know, that doesn't help. We are in an environment where the liability on individuals is boycotted by time. If you look at politicians, what Roger was saying earlier, politicians have got such a short-term cycles. They don't really care about the consequences. Their liability is very, very tiny. I mean, they are imposed for such a short period of time too often to worry about what's happening tomorrow. It's something that their opponents may be picking up or the next government will deal with, because in 4 years I'm out of place and nobody will know what I did. You know, kind of we have a problem of timetable and time lag between things. So unless we do what Emmanuel was in a very figurative way was saying, and we spend the 5 hours of training and doing these things systematically in different places, then it doesn't come naturally when you jump off the plane to pull the right string to open the parachute. And too often the parachute does not open, and we know both in politics as well as sometimes scientists have to learn that.
Thank you. And Fabian, coming back, you said the non-academic world has very different incentives. Can you clarify a little bit what you meant there? And for the think tank world and other non-academic researchers who are providing policy advice, what do you see as the specific challenge and how it differs?
Yes, we've spent a lot of time in the project to discuss these differences, and I think that was also one of the very interesting parts of the project, is actually sharing the different perspectives, because it did show that there were quite different incentives in place. At times when you're looking at the non-academic sector, it's actually the other way around. There are incentives to behave unethically. When we look at the funding structures which are there, for example, it can well be the case that you get funded if you behave unethically. There is far less of a transparency across the whole sector. Very often, people will not even know that this advice and analysis is actually taking place. It's not necessarily taking place within formal structures. A lot of the influencing of policy takes place in informal ways. So it is a very different sector. But I think what is key is that often it is not seen what is happening in this sector. And if we want to go to a more ethical provision of analysis, I think we can encourage the sector and we can try to communicate to the sector about the benefits of following such an approach. But in the end, I think we need also some hard incentives. And hard
what would they
incentives,
look like? What sort of thing would we be talking about?
It can be public recognition for certain behaviors. It can be funding. It can be a way of also punishing the black sheep who are not following the kind of rules. But there's nothing in place at the moment. In fact, we don't even have a sector. There's no recognized boundary towards the sector. So there's a lot of work which needs to be done to get to a position where those in the sector see an ethical framework as something they will want to do because it helps in their work. That's really the key.
Absolutely. David, you wanted to come in.
Well, just to come back to this question of, what are the possible arguments one could run with politicians about why this really matters? I think something that is not often recognized, I think we see that there is a bit of a crisis of trust in democracy and government. That's well understood. And I think what we can also see is there's potentially a bit of a crisis of trust, an epistemic crisis in knowledge and science. And I think what is, however, not often seen is that these crises are linked. And if we don't tackle this epistemic crisis, then our democracy will fall apart. If we lose the mechanisms by which we work through our different understandings of what are the facts, then government and democracy is not possible. If we don't have any common basis for what the hell is going on out there, if we disagree of what is the nature of the problems we face, then it's going to be impossible to mobilize any sort of political will to deal with them. So making sure that we have transparent and trustworthy science is indispensable, not just for science itself, but absolutely fundamental for democracy. So it's this connection between the twin crises of trust in both knowledge and democracy and politics, that they have common sources and they're intertwined, and we somehow see them in separate boxes. And I think that's a bit of a challenge.
Thank you. Roger, a reaction to that, if you would.
I think to some extent it was ever thus, but we see a particularly extreme versions of it at the moment. I think I agree with David's diagnosis, but if you look at the picture of David, you probably think he's sitting in the middle of a beautiful green field, but my suspicion is he's probably sitting in his office in the Berlin one, or maybe not because of COVID. And I think there are different perspectives on this, and I think that the question of how to address the crisis of trust, or what the problem of trust looks like, is different depending on which end of the telescope you're looking from. I think not just a crisis for our society, I think it's a real threat to the institutions. I think the EU does great work, but I think we shouldn't take the EU for granted. And I think that the connection of the crisis of trust in evidence, but also in democracy, I think those two things are linked. But let's remember what Gabi said to us, that very interesting insight about journalists and how they trust the people they know. And I think this points to what we need to do, what we actually need to do. And I think it is about relationship building. I think we do have to bring the public in. I don't just mean about, telling them this is what we've decided to do. Do you think it's a good idea or not? I mean, starting the conversation with the public, starting with an open, but I'm saying, what do you think we should do about this? And actually mining using citizens as a way of policy formulation, right from the very get-go. I think there should be a right for citizens to have scientific data and scientific information, to access it. It's no point us sitting back and complaining that people don't see through the obvious flaws in the evidence if we don't make available to them the intellectual tools and also the education and especially the information that they need to be able to take.
Very much echoing David as well on that point.
As citizens.
Open it up.
That's it.
Yeah, Gabi, can I turn to something slightly different, but it is linked. How do we avoid As Emmanuel said in his opening presentation, this is a signable accord. You can sign up to it. We've also talked, and we'll come back to that, I hope, about how it's an evolving process a bit later. But is there a risk it becomes a tick box exercise? Okay, I've signed the accord, I've done the step accord, I'm compliant. And we start talking about compliance in that rather formalistic way, rather than something we talked, I think it was Yves said in the first panel, he talked about an adaptation of culture, and this being something that very much grows from within organizations and is not top down, as Fabian was saying earlier. How do we make sure, can we make sure it isn't just a tick box exercise?
I don't know if Fabian wanted to follow up on the conversation with Roger, and I give it to talk. No,
okay,
is that okay?
Let me bring
okay,
up.
go
No,
ahead.
I'll
No,
come
no,
back on
that's
that.
fine.
Then, Fabian, I didn't see you. Sorry, wave at me. It's easier than hands that I didn't see in the corner. Fabian first, then, and then I'll come back on that question, Gabi.
And I come back.
Yeah.
I mean, the only point I wanted to make, I think, is I think we need to also avoid being naive. There will be a lot of advice, a lot of analysis going on. Politicians will continue to decide on a number of different categories, of which ethical scientific advice is only one of the variety of things they will draw on. And at times they will also choose to disregard certain elements. Of course, from the perspective of a think tank, I think it would be great, for example, if politicians would always reference us when they're using our material. The reality is we know they don't. And we also are not going to call them out on it, because that's not the best way of actually staying in the good books of the people we're trying to influence. So I think what we need to have, and it was already mentioned at this conference, so we need to have something which can also adapt, which can also develop, which can grow, and which is incentivized internally. So if this is simply a tick box, you might be able to enforce such a tick box on structures like universities, where you can say to them, well, unless you fill in this tick box, you're not going to get the public funding for the research you're doing. But you certainly will not be able to enforce this on the wide variety of other analysts and researchers who will simply ignore it. So unless there is a structure behind it, which helps to encourage it, it's not going to work. And I think this is also following up on everything which was said before at the conference, that really this is, and I'm speaking here predominantly for the non-academic sector, but this is very much a first step. We are nowhere near implementation yet, because a lot more will have to happen to make that work.
And you have suggested one way to take that forward in your sector is through some sort of alliance, think tank alliance, that can work on these issues on an ongoing basis. But Fabian, they're talking about one of the ways we avoid it being a tick box exercise. But Gabi, for you, what is the key to getting people to really absorb this and make it part of their own culture, and not just say, look at me, I signed, I'm accord approved type, you know, like a kite mark or something?
But this is the £1 million question, because obviously we can't do it. As has been said before, these things cannot be imposed top down, and there is not a list of good and bad that you can tick to behave accordingly or to have implemented the framework. That's why, as we were saying, going forward, we would love to have this framework. The people use and abuse the framework in a sense, and abuse in a sense of make it yours, make it what you think is best. So evolve with time, evolve with your own case studies, because that's the way this document become what we've been saying in the session above before, is the living document, the living platform where everybody contributed. To use a fancy word, the autopoietic is a work in itself and develop in itself like a spiral, where people contribute, a little bit like a bigger wiki framework, where people contributed to it and expanded and evolve as the ethical issues do evolve. So it is a very different thing than I sign up. And actually, in my experience, I've been working very closely to one organization, particularly interested to the framework, who at a certain point, right in the middle of the COVID crisis, said, oh no, we put ethics on the side, it's not that important at the moment. And these are the people who are committed to it. So it's really, really difficult unless people buying in and participate into it. One of the original projects or ideas of the framework was an interactive platform, a constantly living lab, where people could get in and out, bringing in their case study, resolve it together and bring out the knowledge of it, or contribute to another piece of the toolkit for, as Sabina was saying. For example, there's not a specific for publishers. No, there isn't, but we can make a one together and we can develop it together.
Do they make it themselves, or do they work with people like you?
We work it together. The idea is to work it together. So knowledge exchanges in that sense. So you bring your case studies, so we bring you with the background that we build these toolbox on. So it is a really very much a shared responsibility rather than a ticking box. I put in my policies and this is what I'm going to do.
Thank you. And just to say, ladies and gentlemen, I do have some more comments than questions in the Q&A box, but they are incredibly long and I can't possibly read read them out, or B, even see at a glance what your central point is or the question you'd like to ask. So could I ask you, please, keep those questions coming, but keep them nice and short. David, on this point about making sure this is more than I signed up and look how good I am, but actually does change cultures, change processes within organizations. And you also talked about structural incentives and what they should look like. What do you think they should look like?
I mean, we certainly within the JRC have a number of ethics codes on all these matters. We follow the best practice in this area, and we've taken some initiatives to upgrade the guidance and the codes that we practice inside the Joint Research Centre. And as in any organisation, that I think has quite a powerful effect on making sure this works. We have an ethics officer who oversees this, who is consulted on various cases and all these sorts of things. So I think we have some good practice within the JRC that we can certainly share. I think in terms of getting this stuff mainstreamed across the research community, I think somehow we have to connect this to becoming an excellent scientist. So somehow to make it clear or obvious to scientists that they're not going to win the Nobel Prizes, they're not going to get into the highly cited journals, they're not going to be effective scientists unless they are really living these principles and values in their work. Because what we know is there is one thing that really gets scientists out of bed and motivates them is peer respect, peer pressure, all these sorts of things. So somehow we have to put this in very much in that space, that if you want to progress as a scientist, if you want to have wonderful collaborations with other people around the world, and if you want to get to the top of your profession, then this is an indispensable way to do that. And I don't immediately see that connection. I'm sure it's there, but that perhaps is something to work on, because then you will go with the natural grain of where scientists want to get to. They all want to do excellent work. They want to collaborate with the best possible people. So somehow if we can tap into those very powerful scientific incentives, I think that will take us forward. And if I could just pick up on one point Fabian raised about not being naive, I would go much further even than Fabian and say that by definition, science or research cannot answer a political question. It can only inform it, but it is a category error to think that there is a scientific answer to a political question. Political questions are normative ones, they're about values, and there are no scientific answers to normative questions. So we need to be extremely clear about the separation between what science can tell us, which is how the world is, and what politics does, which is how the world ought to be. And that distinction really should not be lost in these discussions.
Mm-hmm. But research, as you say, it can't answer political questions, but the fact that science and the basis upon which political decisions are taken, that we know it's evidence-based, makes a big difference.
It makes a transformative difference, because equally politics that is not based upon the best possible account of reality disappears off into la la land. And there are many people who think now that current political discourse is completely disconnected from reality. So science is indispensable to make sure that policy and politics is discussing the world as it is, and there is no better way to find out how the world as it is than science. But it cuts both ways.
Absolutely. So Roger, taking what David said and moving it into the political world, he said scientists should know you won't get to the top if you don't apply these principles. Same for researchers, think tanks trying to influence policy, influence political decisions. You won't be listened to if you don't. And as a politician, if you don't show that you ask the right questions of the evidence, you could get found out and your public credibility. And I wanted to go back to that question at the beginning about credibility, because is there a way to convince politicians that proving that what they're doing is based on evidence and not just on a gut feel is important? Roger and then Fabian.
You could be found out, Jacki, is a very good point, but I don't think that's what's keeping politicians awake at night. I feel for Fabian when he says that he comes up with these excellent ideas at the European Policy Centre, which is true, and politicians take him credit for that. There's a way around that, by the way, Fabian. We do the same at New Europeans. We just have to do that thing of pointing it out for each other. So I will tell the politicians what excellent work you've done at the EPC if you've done what we've done at New Europeans. But no, I think they should be doing that. I think they should reference things. I think this sort of conversation is helpful. But as David said, politics is an art, not a science. And their judgment, you elect politicians, remember, to take decisions, and often there are no good options, and they have to choose between things that are difficult, and they have to prioritize things. And those sorts of judgments are not necessarily evidence-based. And I think also much of the implementation and the success of policies, once you've decided on them, is premised on people's being able to change people's behavior, the public's behavior. COVID is a very good example of that, getting people to wear masks who don't want to wear them. That isn't necessarily something that's going to be driven by evidence. But I do think that we should, when it comes to holding politicians to account, one of the questions we should ask them is what do they base their evidence on? I think that's a very, very important question to ask them. And also, I just say this, I mean, you don't have to subject every single policy that a politician makes to the rigors of the ProRes Accord. You know, we have all sorts of mechanisms, particularly at the point where, you know, there are different stages of politics. And then just let me very quickly say this. I mean, there's a point where you decide what your policy is and you compete and you try to get your policy through. But then when you're actually legislating, we sometimes talk about pre-legislative scrutiny before a law comes into the parliamentary cycle during that process. And remember, we do this in other areas. We have fiscal impact reports. We have environmental reports. We even have human rights reports. We test policy as they go through the legislative process. And perhaps that might be an opportunity to actually say, you know, ask more questions, more detailed questions about evidence. And then if you need a toolkit to be able to do that, how do we actually do that? Remember, Gabi has also been very helpful. I don't know if it's a coincidence, any female speaker on our panel, being very focused on the practical things we can do. Yeah. You know, maybe that's something that we can actually do. We can say, well, here's the ProRes one. Why don't we try and test it with that? You don't need to test all of policy, but sometimes to sort of just do a little Stichprobe, as they say in Germany, just do a little, you know, test out of the blue. That might be also a practical way forward.
Thank you. I want to focus very much on those practical next steps in a moment, but Fabian, you wanted to come in.
I just wanted to challenge something a little bit, which was in the conversation, which was this idea that if you conduct yourself ethically, you get to the top. And I think particularly for the non-academic sector, where people are not necessarily motivated by the same things. So if you're talking about peer acknowledgement or academic excellence, that doesn't mean very much in the non-academic sector. There are, of course, people there who will be motivated by the relevance of what they do, by the usefulness to policymakers. But there will also be people in the sector who are motivated, for example, by profit. So it's a much wider range. And in some of these areas, we have seen that by acting unethically, some people have been spectacularly successful. If you look at, for example, ways of research into manipulating voters, into doing things to our democracies, which are not necessarily advisable, but this can be very profitable. This can get you very much to the top. And there are a number of politicians out there who will be very happy to use that kind of evidence and research. So I think we need to distinguish between that. And we need to make clear that this is not going to work unless there are very strong incentives. Why it makes sense also in the incentive structure, in the kind of things which motivate non-academic researchers. Because otherwise, I'm afraid what we could end up with is something where in the visible part, people are following this kind of rule. But in all of that which goes on behind the scenes, the rules have no meaning. And actually politicians increasingly go into this behind the scenes advice because it is not constrained.
Thank you very much. Gabi, I don't know whether you want to react to this. And then in our last 15 minutes, I really would like to focus on those steps forward. Where do we go from here? What is the road ahead to take all this immensely valuable work that you've been doing in the project and build on it? Yves described it as a first building block earlier. How do we translate it into actions and build on it? But did you want to react to this discussion about the incentive and how we create it?
Well, this is a very long-term kind of discussion in terms of incentives. As Fabian was saying, create some frameworks in which people will have some kind of standards, for nothing else, not only to engage with or to, as you were saying, tick in the box, but really embed it as part of their practice, which is the most difficult things. And I just want to remind everyone that this is the final conference of ProRes. So as it happened too often with this project, we only had 3 years to get where we got to. And we need a ProRes too. We really need to go to the next step where we actually could bring to fruition what we learn through the process of creating the framework in itself. There's a lot to do, and we actually learned a lot over the knowledge formation process, and how this, David referred very often to academics and academics incentives to be ethical and trustworthy. But Fabian immediately said, well, this is not the whole world. And as we were saying earlier, the knowledge society is made of so many actors. And one of my colleagues at the LSE used to say, I only advise comment, and then it's their decisions. Ethics is not something that you can impose, it's not something that you can prescribe, and it's not a law that you can actually monitor and implement with enforcement and send the police to make sure that people do behave properly. It's a process and it's a mindset changing, and it's not a fixed framework. So we really, I mean, we've been talking so much among us partners of ProRes. How do we do this interactive framework? How do we pursue in certain organizations, for example, that not only they adopt and endorse and tick off the box of signing it, the step code, but they actually work on it, implement and complement it.
And your answer to that in terms of the next steps, the way forward?
Difficult to say. ProRes 2, the sequel. Just joking apart, is really engaging with this organization. As the European Alliance, as a Fabian organization, think tank, and others, we have been seriously engaging directly. We established a network of trust, if we want to say that. We have some organization with whom we work very closely during the project. We got some very important and key stakeholders, like, for example, the International Network of Global Science Advisory. It's been really an interesting community setting in a way, and we will carry on the conversation with them directly, really in practice, not aspirational, not for a long-term vision, but very much really for implementing step by step what we've been working on. Also,
so very much echoing, Yves talked about the very fact of raising awareness, going out, discussing the work you've done, discussing events like this and moving around Europe. He said that very fact is already the beginning of the process of getting the take up, getting the buy-in that you want. David, how do you see the way forward? And if you were advising those who've been involved in the project on how to make sure this does translate from the framework into something that is used and is a living thing, for want of a better word, what would you say is the way forward now?
So I've dealt with a similar problem in how do we get scientists to want to focus on policy issues, and the big mistake that's made by people working in that field is to see this only as a supply side issue and concentrate on getting better supply, but it's as much a demand side issue. And therefore, I think my suggestion for how to get greater take up of the Accord and the toolkit is also to seek ways to grow the demand. So can we get more discriminating, more critical, more skeptical policymakers within the EU and elsewhere who are asking the questions of the people coming to them with the evidence? So, you know, is your evidence transparent? Have you exposed it to outside critical scrutiny? That, I think, is absolutely fundamental. And I fully take Fabian's point about the think tank sector and the nuance, the distinction between that and the scientific sector. Although the scientific and research community does not have a completely unblemished record either in this respect. So that, I think, is what we need to do, is to work on the demand. Is let's have more challenging, demanding policymakers who hold the knowledge providers to much higher standards, and they can point to the Accord and the framework to do that. And just a little piece of work that we are doing in this area, we are thinking about what are the future skills that European Union policymakers are going to need, with a vision towards developing the profession of policy making strategically in the Commission. And if you're interested, we published a future competence framework trying to identify what skills policymakers will need. And we put front and center in the future skills that European policymakers are going to need, the ability to critically analyze and interrogate the knowledge when it comes in, to spot the good from the bad. That's going to be an absolute, it already is a fundamental skill, because if you work on a policy file, you're bombarded with goodness knows how many information sets. And the ability to spot the good from the bad is going to be a critical policy making skill. So that, I think, is perhaps one way into it, is let's think about growing the capacity of policymakers to demand much higher standards from think tanks.
And that's really interesting, David, because that mirrors a debate we've been having about social media and so on, and how do we get the public, give the public the skills to question what they read, what they see, identify misinformation, disinformation. You're saying this similar parallel process needs to go on within policymaking.
I think it's a bit different with the public and the policy-making professionals. I think I think when it comes to the public, it's transparency, transparency, transparency. So if the knowledge comes to you by a back channel, and then I think policymakers need to be more skeptical and say, you know, this is all very interesting, but I can't possibly read it or take it into account until I see that you've published it and you've had an open workshop. And you know, this stuff is no good to me until I see that it's been peer reviewed. I think if policymakers start to say that, that could begin to change the incentives. You know, I'm not even going to read it until I know that it's been subject to public critical scrutiny. How can we get that sort of instinct and reflex and response amongst policymakers?
And that, Roger, is where the toolbox provides those questions, helps policymakers to know what are the right questions I should be asking. And David going further there and saying, not just asking the right questions, but setting certain benchmarks, certain criteria. Do you see a way, notwithstanding your cynicism about modern politicians, to grow that demand?
I'm not cynical. I'm one of the most idealistic people you could meet, Jacki, but have another conversation.
Sorry.
But I'm glad to Su-Ming, who did in the chat, point out that the nightmare, epistemic nightmare, is the same as epistemic cynicism. So perhaps that's what made you use that word. I'm skeptical that, I mean, I think we all want to do our jobs better. We all want to improve, but I'm skeptical that just having better policymakers is going to solve all our problems. I think the problem is that, yeah, it's not just the lies that some politicians tell. Much bigger problem is that too many of the public tend to believe them. And perhaps even are inclined to believe them. And, you know, I think we learned from, I'm not going to use the B word, but I think we learned from what happened in the UK that, you know, just going around telling people we are more intelligent, we know more, we know what's good for you, and now we're going to tell them not only do we have more information, but it's been ethically sourced. I'm not sure that's going to be the way that we're going to convince the public. I'm much more in favor of what Gabi has been saying to us. I found that really interesting about this idea of networks of trust, building up networks of trust. We talked about that before. It takes a long time to build trust, like building peace. It's not just something that happens by itself. You have to work on it constantly, every day in very small ways. You can lose trust very quickly, and when you do, it's almost impossible to get it back again. But to create it, to build it in the first place is really an endeavor. And I think the effort needs to be with the public. I think that's where the emphasis needs to be. I don't think it's just a question of transparency, although transparency is important. I think it's also about public education, and it's about sharing responsibility, really bringing, we've got the Conference on the Future of Europe at the moment, but only 25,000 out of 450 million EU citizens have engaged with it so far. And that, to me, screams out for you know, a bit more attention, a bit more effort. And I think if we are bringing the citizens more into the policy-making process, we need to equip them with these tools, including the ProRes one, and help them to understand how they can think critically about the future of these policy areas that on which all our lives depend.
Thank you very much. Fabian.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think we need to be careful about what we're asking of policymakers, because very often science, academic research doesn't supply what they want. So the idea that they will be the gatekeepers in some way, I think is, I think we should help them to understand evidence better, but I don't think they can act as a gatekeeper. And when it comes to policy question, very often, for example, the speed matters, the applicability of what you're giving them, the relevance of what you're saying to their immediate problems matters. So the idea that, for example, one of the things which we continuously encounter is academic research takes too long. If you have to get into peer review processes, etc., by the time you have completed all of that to answer a question of a policymaker, the world has moved on. So we have to keep also that in mind. And for that reason, I think there are a number of incentives which can be put into place also for the advice givers, for those who are directly involved with these processes. But it's not going to happen unless there are concrete incentives. And I know I've been going back to that, but I really think that that is the crucial element, because otherwise we can all talk about that it would be a nice thing, but I'm afraid it's not going to happen.
Thank you very much. Gabi, you want to come in a very quick one if you would, because we're almost out of time.
Yeah, just to say, I really believe in the community of trust a little bit, but I want to say be aware of the community of practice. I've been working in Brussels in the interface between science and policy for years now, and there is two different things. And community of practice are those who actually manage to very successfully influence themselves about one single idea that might not be a good one. So it's not necessarily always the same, so talking about community of trust or community of practice. So just a little distinction following up from Roger was saying.
Absolutely. So we've talked about a huge number of issues in the last hour. I just wanted to ask each of you in a sentence, and we've talked, David, you talked about growing the demand, a very practical first step for each of you to go from this first building block, as Yves described it earlier on, to turn it into, and I love Gabi's phrase about she wants people to use it and abuse it. What for each of you in half a minute would be a key, very practical next step to take this work forward. And I'll go Roger, David, Gabi, and Fabian. Roger first.
I would put the toolkit out for public consultation. I would engage with big organizations in civil society like European Civic Forum and other platforms, ask them what they think about it, how they get their evidence, and whether this type of framework would be useful and helpful to them. I think if you get the consent of practitioners, particularly in civil society, thinking about these sorts of questions, ask the right questions rather than just telling everybody you've already got the answer. And I think discussion around this is would be a good way forward with civil society stakeholders.
Thank you very much. David.
I would engage with my colleagues in the Commission in charge of the better regulation process and see how this lands with them and whether this is in tune with the recent better regulation communication, which I think it is, which includes very clearly calls for evidence in that, and see how it can dovetail with the ideas and the guidelines in relation to better regulation.
Thank you very much. Gabi.
Well, we already start doing, Roger, what you were suggesting. So we got a range of stakeholders who at the moment are playing with the toolbox. Use it. Tell us what the bottlenecks are, what the issues are, if it gets stuck somewhere. As soon as we've done that, we have a larger circle for people to reach out. And the month of October will be dedicated to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fabian, a final word?
I would support the establishment of the European Alliance of Think Tanks. I won't have time to go into detail on what I mean by that, but I've posted the link on Twitter while we had this discussion, and it's also on the EPC website and also on some of the ProRes materials. So you can find it on the ProRes website as well. But this is about, for me, now creating the practical steps which are needed to create the incentives so that the non-academic sector also implements this.
Absolutely, and you talk about it for that sector, but those sorts of platforms, forums, very important right across all the different sectors that you hope to reach with this accord. I'm afraid that is all we have time for, but thank you very much, panel, for a great discussion. Lots more to be done. I don't think it is only the end of the beginning as this project draws to a close. There is a great deal of work to be done, and you've charted the way forward, as did our previous panel and our opening speakers. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to the project for hosting us today. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this discussion, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you, panel, and goodbye.
Thank you, Jacki, for chairing it.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Great
Jacki.
pleasure, an honor. Take care.
Thank